began with a flicker and unexpected radar pulse near Tokmak that lasted barely 3 seconds, but was enough to change the rhythm of the battlefield. In an age when wars are fought as much in the electromagnetic spectrum as on the ground, that brief emission was all Ukrainian reconnaissance needed. Satellite intelligence relayed by NATO picked up the signal a Russian Buk M2 or Tor M1 radar had blinked on to track low-flying drones. Within minutes, mission planners in central Ukraine prepared a response that would show how legacy airframes, when paired with modern Western weaponry, could outthink and outfight even the most sophisticated air defense grids. As dusk fell over the front line, a Ukrainian Su-27 flanker, its twin Saturn AL-31F engines, barely audible over the wind, powered up from an undisclosed airbase. Beneath its wings hung an American-made AGM-88 HARM high-speed anti-radiation missile, a weapon designed to hunt the very signals that just betrayed the radar's position. According to Defense News and Reuters field reports, such joint configuration Soviet platforms carrying NATO missiles had become the defining hallmark of Ukraine's 2025 air campaign, merging decades of Soviet aerodynamics with 21st century electronic warfare. The operation was simple in theory, but lethal in execution. Find the source of that radar blink lock on before the system shut down again and strike before the Russians could relocate or camouflage it. Inside Ukraine's air defense suppression cell, analysts cross-referenced the radar signature with data from US RC-135 Rivet Joint Surveillance aircraft orbiting over the Black Sea. The pattern matched a Tor M1 battery recently repositioned to cover drone gaps near Melitopol. That meant a short window, no more than 6 minutes before the battery's crew changed location. The Su-27 pilot descended to treetop level following pre-mapped corridors through low radar reflectivity zones. Every valley and ridge had been analyzed for electromagnetic cover, every movement timed to avoid Russian early warning sweeps from Crimea. It's a chess game played at supersonic speed, said retired RAF Air Commodore Andrew Curtis in an interview with BBC Defense Analysis. Whoever controls the spectrum controls the tempo. As the flanker approached launch range, the radar warning receiver lit up briefly, a confirmation that the enemy radar was active again, scanning for UAVs. That was the trigger. The pilot steadied, locked the coordinates, and released the HARM. The missile tore forward, accelerating to Mach 2.2, its seeker head sniffing for the radar's energy like a wolf catching scent of prey. Seconds later, silence. No one on the ground saw it coming. The detonation ripped through the radar vehicle, sending fragments spiraling across a field of shattered antennae. Satellite imagery later confirmed a complete systems kill, an entire air defense node, blinded in under 90 seconds. Ukrainian command hailed it not merely as a tactical strike, but as a demonstration of how precision electromagnetic warfare could collapse a defensive web without deploying a full squadron. The question now analysts asked was not whether the missile worked it clearly had, but how this fusion of East and West technology might redefine air combat strategy across Europe. Could future NATO operations adopt similar hybrid tactics to defeat dense air defenses in other theaters, like the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf? As the burning remains of the Russian radar smoldered outside Tokmak, the Su-27's pilot banked low and west, slipping into what Ukrainian planners called the Shadow Corridor. It was an invisible highway through the electromagnetic spectrum, a thread of silence between overlapping Russian radar cones. The path had been carved from months of reconnaissance by satellites, drones, and NATO's airborne early warning platforms. Every kilometer of airspace was a calculation, a contest of probability and timing. One wrong move, one premature radar ping, and the flanker would be marked for destruction. Ukraine's command centers relied heavily on real-time feeds from NATO intelligence partners. According to BBC Defense Watch, Allied AWACS aircraft in Romanian airspace provided situational awareness, identifying every radar emission jamming beam and surface-to-air missile activation. The Su-27's pilot used this dynamic map to weave through gaps his radar switched off to maintain stealth. Even though the aircraft's airframe dated back to the 1980s, the integration of digital emission control algorithms upgraded locally in 2025 gave it a second life in the modern battle space. Below Russian units scrambled to restore situational coverage. Mobile Buk M2 launchers repositioned to plug the hole left by the destroyed Tor battery. The air was thick with confusion. Without their radar eyes, the defenders fired sporadically, relying on optical systems ill-suited for night tracking. The Ukrainian jet exploited that chaos, banking at low altitude through agricultural terrain and returning towards safer skies, all while secondary UAVs loitered to document the aftermath. Western analysts described the tactic as distributed suppression, a layered approach combining manned jets, loitering munitions, and electronic decoys. Jane's Defense Weekly noted that Ukrainian planners had shifted from direct engagements to electronic attrition, methodically dismantling Russia's radar coverage sector by sector. Instead of sending waves of aircraft, Ukraine now used precision bursts, one a mission, one missile, one node down. The flankers' crew followed a route that used terrain masking using river valleys and power line corridors as cover from long-range radar. Each maneuver was rehearsed down to seconds. The pilot's helmet display showed predictive radar fields generated by AI modeling an innovation reportedly built from US and Czech software adapted to Ukrainian conditions. In practical terms, it turned the old Soviet cockpit into a digital war room, allowing the pilot to see invisible threats before they appeared. Every flight over the front is like walking through a minefield you can't see, said retired US Air Force Colonel Mark Gunther to Defense News. But what's remarkable is how Ukraine's engineers managed to bridge 40-year-old aircraft with modern Western missile logic, its improvisation elevated to doctrine. The mission's success also depended on timing. Reports from Reuters confirmed that Russian forces had increased radar cycling intervals, turning systems on for mere seconds to avoid anti-radiation strikes. That meant Ukrainian aircraft needed split-second coordination between SIGINT intercepts and pilot reactions. Artificial intelligence now managed this synchronization in real time, feeding the pilot missile queue data within 2 seconds of detection. As dawn broke, the Su-27 disappeared back into the haze, escorted home by drone reconnaissance screens. The mission would be debriefed for weeks, its data feeding into NATO's shared seed suppression of enemy air defense archives. But the question that haunted Moscow's defense circles was simple. If one radar pulse could bring destruction, how could their entire integrated network survive a coordinated wave of such strikes? By sunrise, Ukrainian analysts had already reconstructed the engagement frame by frame. The radar's death captured in infrared by a Bayraktar TB2 wasn't just another successful strike, it was a live experiment in electronic warfare choreography. What followed in the control room in Dnipro was a rapid-fire analysis of how the Su-27 achieved a clean firing solution amid one of the densest anti-air environments on Earth. The secret lay in the electronic countermeasure ECM ballet that played out seconds before the missile release. As the Su-27 neared engagement range, ground-based jammers in Zaporizhzhia began emitting deceptive interference, flooding Russian receivers with ghost targets. Simultaneously, small R-18 drones scattered chaff clouds along the approach vector, creating radar snow. This multi-domain deception blinded local Buk and S-300 crews, forcing them to switch frequencies, exactly what the HARM missile's seeker loved most. The AGM-88's seeker head upgraded to Block V standard had what military engineers called reactive homing logic. It could lock onto radars even after they switched off. That meant that the moment Russian operators realized they were under attack and powered down their system, the missile remembered the last known emission pattern and continued home on trajectory. Within 30 seconds of launch, the HARM was supersonic Mach 2.2 and climbing, weaving through electronic clutter as if guided by instinct. Observers from Jane's Defense Weekly called the strike a masterclass in precision suppression. The HARM's terminal phase was a corkscrewing dive and aerodynamic dance that outmaneuvered both terrain and countermeasures. The missile's 66-kilogram fragmentation warhead detonated directly above the radar mast, ensuring complete antenna destruction without leaving the radar truck's chassis recognizable. A BBC analysis estimated that the Russian battery lost $25 million equipment within 2 minutes and more critically suffered a 3-hour blackout in its command relay network. For Ukrainian planners, this blackout was gold. The disruption opened an opportunity for artillery and drone teams to hit nearby supply convoys without fear of guided interception. A single radar knockout can open a 40-kilometer corridor of operational freedom, noted Dr. Helena Strauss, a defense systems analyst from the German Bundeswehr University, speaking to DW News. That's the real power of precision SAD, strategic paralysis through electromagnetic blindness. Meanwhile, Russian commanders scrambled to locate the launch site, deploying Orlan-30 reconnaissance drones to scan potential areas. But by then, the Su-27 was already exfiltrating its electronic signature, lost in the web of jamming and decoys. For Moscow, this strike represented a growing nightmare. Ukrainian forces were no longer reacting. They were orchestrating multi-domain ambushes, leveraging NATO data, Western missile intelligence, and old Soviet airframes into seamless operations. Strategically, it showed the world something something profound, that technological asymmetry when used creatively could outweigh even numerical superiority. This revelation rippled across Western defense think tanks. Could smaller nations like Finland or Taiwan adopt similar hybrid CD models against larger adversaries? Would this form of smart attrition warfare become the template for 21st century air campaigns? As the battlefield adapted, the Russians too began to experiment rotating mobile radars hourly using passive detection systems and integrating Cuba-developed ELINT arrays to identify incoming harm signatures. Yet each adaptation forced resource reallocation, draining fuel, manpower, and logistics. Ukraine's aim wasn't just destruction, it was exhaustion. And as a Pentagon analyst told Al Jazeera, this wasn't about killing radars. It was about teaching the Russian network to fear its own emissions. The question left hanging over the war room was simple yet chilling. What happens when silence becomes more dangerous than sound? Hours after the strike, the sky over Zaporizhzhia was eerily quiet, too quiet for Russian commanders' comfort. When the radar went dark, its absence rippled through the entire integrated air defense system, IADS, like a heartbeat skipped. The destroyed node was part of a tri-layered detection web tied to long-range S-400 batteries and medium-range Buck M2 launchers. Its loss blinded a 70-kilometer slice of front-forcing nearby units to overcompensate. Within minutes, backup sensors across Melitopol and Crimea lit up simultaneously, painting the airwaves in confusion. That was precisely what Ukraine's planners had predicted. The Su-27 strike wasn't an isolated hit, it was bait. As Russian radars scrambled to fill the void, they over-emitted, producing a flood of signals detectable by NATO's Rivet joint aircraft orbiting above Romania and the RQ-4 Global Hawk near the Black Sea. This shockwave effect, as Defense News later termed it, allowed Ukrainian intelligence to map fresh emitter positions across the southern front. Every radar that blinked on was marked for the next wave of seed sorties. In a matter of hours, Ukrainian analysts built a dynamic radar atlas, a living chart of Russian air defenses constantly updated by satellite and drone surveillance. The next phase of the operation unleashed kamikaze drones and cruise missiles guided through the corridors the Su-27 had opened. Each strike refined the map further, and each emission gave away another Russian unit's location. The technological sophistication of this feedback loop stunned even Western observers. "This is what electronic dominance looks like," said Dr. Peter Laird, a senior systems expert with the Royal United Services Institute, in an interview with BBC World Defense. "It's not about destroying everything, it's about forcing the enemy to reveal themselves faster than they can adapt." The Ukrainians turned a single missile shot into an information cascade. For the Russian side, the problem wasn't just material loss, it was psychological fatigue. Air defense crews grew hesitant to activate their radars, fearing the next invisible missile already homing in. Some switched to manual optical tracking, a tactic reminiscent of the Cold War, but useless against modern low observable drones. Reuters confirmed that by mid-2025, Russia's southern air defense network had begun relying heavily on mobile radar relays and silent sentry systems, which detect electronic reflections instead of emitting signals. It was a stopgap, not a solution. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian General Staff coordinated joint operations with NATO's electronic warfare units stationed in Poland, further tightening the electromagnetic noose. The fusion of data from drones, satellites, and AWACS allowed near real-time strike authorization. What once took 20 minutes now happened in under 120 seconds. That operational tempo was a first in Eastern Europe's history. The most remarkable evolution came from algorithmic warfare. Machine learning systems trained on Russian radar behavior predicted when and where new emitters would appear. The Su-27's mission fed the algorithm, which later guided long-range Storm Shadow and Scalp EG missiles to successive targets. Every radar pulse became a breadcrumb, one NATO official told DW, and Ukraine followed the trail straight into Russia's electronic heart. Yet beneath this triumph lay a sobering question, one that NATO analysts debated behind closed doors. Could Russia's inevitable countermeasure, a full-spectrum jamming offensive, blind not only Ukraine, but also NATO's satellites and reconnaissance channels? As one American defense expert warned, the next phase of the war may not be fought with missiles, but with silence itself. As news of the radar strike spread across military circles, Ukraine's allies quietly recognized it as a watershed moment in modern sea doctrine. For the first time in the war, a Soviet-era fighter had not only survived deep inside a Russian-controlled kill zone, but had also weaponized its enemy's own emissions. NATO analysts began dissecting the mission frame by frame during closed sessions in Brussels and Ramstein. What they discovered was a perfect example of hybrid electronic warfare where human intuition and machine learning fused into one lethal rhythm. The Su-27's raid was followed by waves of secondary strikes. Ukrainian Su-24s and MiG-29s, retrofitted to carry HARM and British Storm Shadow missiles coordinated with long-range Neptune systems on the coast. Together they formed a kill chain linking air, sea, and cyber domains. Western defense experts hailed this as a tactical renaissance, a scenario where old airframes once considered obsolete now outperformed expectations due to intelligent modernization. What Ukraine did was take legacy Soviet hardware and inject NATO's nervous system into it, explained Dr. Martin Hayes, senior analyst at Defense News Europe. That's a force multiplier even the Pentagon is studying. On the ground, Russian units felt the consequences. Without radar coverage, logistics convoys operated in blind zones, and drone operators lost synchronization with air defense grids. Ukrainian Lelika and Fury UAVs slipped through striking ammunition depots and command posts. By the time Russian technicians replaced the destroyed radar with a mobile backup, their electronic perimeter had been mapped and compromised again. This wasn't random attrition, it was design degradation. Western observers were equally fascinated by the AI-assisted battle rhythm. Algorithms trained on previous radar shutdowns began anticipating Russian reaction times, allowing Ukrainian strikes to preemptively arrive just as radars powered back on. This predictive engagement style had roots in American Wild Weasel missions from the Vietnam era, but had now evolved into something far faster, far smarter. This is algorithmic warfare in its purest form, said Lieutenant Colonel Richard Palmer Rhett, a former F-16 pilot speaking to BBC World Analysis. The Ukrainians turned seconds into weapons. By mid-June 2025, the ripple effects reached beyond Ukraine. Israel's Air Force, facing evolving radar challenges in Syria and Iran, reportedly studied the Tokmak strike as a model for penetrating mobile air defense bubbles. Meanwhile, the US Navy began testing similar software in the Pacific against simulated Chinese radar networks, integrating predictive emission mapping into FA-18 and F-35 systems. The cross-theater influence of this single Ukrainian operation became impossible to ignore. But technology wasn't the only player tactics evolved alongside it. Ukrainian crews began rotating decoys and false signatures through electronic terrain, forcing Russian radars to waste expensive SAM interceptors on empty signals. It became a war of patience and perception rather than steel and fire. Each time Russia fires, Ukraine learns, wrote The Guardian's military columnist Anthony Lloyd, and each lesson rewrites the next chapter of air warfare. Yet this innovation came at a price. The electromagnetic spectrum over southern Ukraine grew saturated, unpredictable, and volatile. Interference began to affect civilian communications, prompting concerns about electronic collateral damage. Still, Kiev pressed on, believing that dominance in the invisible war would define survival in the visible one. The success of the Su-27's mission proved one enduring truth in the age of drones, AI, and radar ghosts. The side that controls the spectrum controls the sky. And as Trump's administration reinforced military aid under the renewed Strategic Deterrence Initiative, the West's next challenge loomed. Could this doctrine be scaled into a continental shield, or was it unique to Ukraine's relentless innovation? The aftermath of the Su-27 strike rippled far beyond Ukraine's skies. It rewired how militaries across the world viewed air defense survival and the limits of technological adaptation. Within days, satellite footage analyzed by Reuters confirmed that Russia began dismantling several of its static radar installations in Zaporizhzhia and Luhansk, opting instead for highly mobile short-burst emitters mounted on all-terrain vehicles. The goal was simple: stay alive long enough to detect, then disappear before the next HARM missile arrived. But this reactive posture exposed a deeper truth: mobility without integration equals vulnerability. Each time Russian units moved, coordination between radar missile batteries and command nodes lagged by minutes or even hours. Those gaps became lethal. Ukrainian planners exploited them with relentless precision, using AI-driven coordination systems linked through Starlink-secured channels to strike during transition windows. The Russians were dancing in the dark, noted Collier David Reynolds, a NATO electronic warfare expert, quoted by Defense News. Every emission, every movement Ukraine turned them into predictive code. In Washington, the Trump administration cited the Tokmak operation as proof that Western military technology, when localized and adapted, could yield disproportionate effects. Trump authorized an expansion of Project Spectral Shield, a joint US-NATO initiative to accelerate the development of anti-radiation drone swarms and compact jamming pods for legacy aircraft. What happened over Tokmak, said Pentagon spokesperson Lieutenant General Marie Connolly, is the blueprint for warfare in contested airspace. You don't overpower, you outthink. Meanwhile, Russian defense publications grudgingly acknowledged the setback. In Krasnaya Zvezda, one analyst described the strike as an electromagnetic ambush, admitting that Western integration had given Ukraine a temporary but decisive spectral superiority. Still, Moscow was already developing countermeasures, deploying Krasuka-4 jamming systems and passive radar arrays developed in collaboration with Iran and Belarus. These systems could track aircraft based on radio reflections rather than emissions, potentially neutralizing harm's homing advantage. Yet, as DW reported, these newer technologies came at enormous logistical cost and required delicate calibration, something the Russian front, already strained by drone attrition and ammunition shortages, could ill afford. In Kyiv, military engineers and pilots debriefed the mission with surgical precision. The data gathered radar frequencies, emission durations, harm trajectory logs fed directly into a NATO database now shared with partner nations from Poland to Japan. The Ukrainian Air Force, once dismissed as outdated, had become a live laboratory of modern warfare, teaching NATO how to fight smarter, not larger. Western experts compared it to how Finland once used terrain and mobility against the Soviet Union, only this time the battlefield was digital and the weapon was information. By late summer 2025, the lessons from Tokmak had already evolved into Operation Blind Storm, a coordinated campaign targeting radar clusters along the southern corridor. Reports from The Guardian indicated a 38% reduction in Russian radar uptime, effectively cutting missile interception capability by nearly half in that sector. It wasn't brute destruction, it was systemic paralysis. For every Russian adjustment, Ukraine's digital warfare units learned faster, algorithms refined engagement predictions, and pilots gained confidence flying at the edge of the electromagnetic abyss. NATO, Israel, and even Pacific partners quietly adopted fragments of Ukraine's data-driven CAD doctrine into their own playbooks. As night fell again over the steppes, another Su-27 taxied onto a dimly lit runway, its underbelly carrying the familiar slender shape of an AGM-88. The pilot's mission briefing was simple: detect, strike, vanish. But behind that simplicity lay an entire revolution, a war fought not just with missiles and machines, but with information anticipation and silence. And as one BBC analyst summarized, Tokmak wasn't just a battle, it was a signal, the first spark of a new electronic era, one where the side that speaks the least may win the loudest victory. The question now echoes across think tanks from Brussels to Washington. If information has become the ultimate weapon, who will control its silence next? The destruction of the Russian air defense radar near Tokmak by a Ukrainian Su-27, armed with an AGM-88 HARM missile, was more than a tactical victory, it was a technological awakening. The operation fused Soviet airframes with Western precision weaponry, AI-driven coordination, and real-time data from NATO reconnaissance, creating a new blueprint for electronic warfare. By turning radar emissions into vulnerabilities, Ukraine achieved strategic disruption far beyond the immediate battlefield, exposing the fragility of static defense systems in modern conflict. The strike's ripple effects reshaped global doctrine. NATO, Israel, and US forces studied its mechanics to refine their own suppression tactics. Russia, forced into defensive adaptation, relied on mobility and passive sensors, but at heavy logistical cost. As President Trump's administration expanded cooperative defense projects under Spectral Shield, the Tokmak mission became a defining moment in 21st century warfare, a demonstration that innovation and adaptability, not numerical, might dictate survival. In this new electromagnetic frontier, silence itself has become the